On this week's episode of Masters of the Craft, your friend Charles Johnson is on the episode. For the folks that don't know Mr. Johnson's work, can you kind of set up who he is and where they might have seen his work?
Yeah, Charles Johnson is he's a friend of mine who was also a friend of August Wilson's as well. So August was sort of, I guess we met separately, but we all sort of knew each other. They hung out more because we're closer in age. I'm the young guy. But anyway, Charles Johnson was a teacher at the University of Washington for, I think, 33 years, something like that, 30 years or something. He taught creative writing. And in fact, one of his students wrote the book Snow Falling on Cedars. So his students have gone on to great things, but couldn't be a nicer guy. Always very kind to me. In fact, I went to a thing where he was getting an award. So Chuck's getting this award, and they're presenting him with the award. And the first part of his speech was praising my books, which I did not expect. It was like a commercial for my stuff. He really is a very supportive guy of my work, and but couldn't be a nicer, smarter, more compassionate human being.
Perfect. All right, Charles Johnson.
Hello, and welcome to You Are a Storyteller, Masters of the Craft, a conversational series hosted by author and filmmaker Brian McDonald. In this episode, Brian is joined by author and scholar Charles Johnson. Charles shares why novelists shouldn't ever stop learning and how a great mentor can help an artist discover smarter, more skillful ways to approach their work.
I know that you grew up not in Chicago, but just outside of Chicago, right?
It's a suburb of Chicago called Evanston.
Yeah, Evanston. Can you talk about what that was like at that time?
Well, okay, I was born in 1948, right? So I'm growing up as a kid in the suburb of Evanston in the 50s and into the early 60s, right? I always describe it as being a kind of leave it to beaver town. It was very quiet. Northwestern is there. My high school, Evanston Township High School, was rated the #1 best public high school in the country when I was a student there. We had black students accounted for about 11% of the student body population at the high school. And you had people who were kind of wealthy. I mean, they were wealthy. And so they funded a very good school system. So I had all kinds of classes in literature and art. I mean, that's really what I was passionate about from the time I was a kid, in the 50s, drawing. That's all I wanted to do. Matter of fact, I applied to an art school and got in Illinois. But then I was talking to my art teacher one day. It was like my senior year. And I had spent, the whole time I was in high school drawing, for the student paper, right? I got 2 awards from Columbia University, had a national high school cartoonist contest. I got 2 second places, one for a panel and one for a strip. That I did with a buddy called Wonder Wildcat. The reason that was our school motto, the Wildcats, because Northwestern was the Wildcats, okay? So we were in the shadow of Northwestern University. But I bailed out. I was talking to my art teacher, and he said, Chuck, you're going to be an artist, and you're going to be a cartoonist, man. You're going to have a really rough life, okay? It's going to be really... So I panicked and went back to my advisor, and I said, look, I'm accepted in our school, but Mr. Reckway says artists have a hard life. What am I going to do? I mean, I can't apply to another school because everybody in May has got their school selected. So she opened her big book and found a school, Southern Illinois University. Said you could go there and major in journalism. You've been writing for the school paper. You've been drawing. So I said, okay, that's what I'll do. So I didn't go as I had wanted to do, dreamed of doing all through high school, to art school. I went and majored in journalism. And that was an interesting experience for me because at that time, 1966, the journalism school, which was actually pretty well known at the time. It was started by old newsmen. Howard Long was the guy who started it. And as students, we worked on the paper. We got paid for it, right? I mean, I spent 4 years drawing editorial cartoons and panel cartoons, and illustrations for this. But one requirement that all journalism majors had in 1966 was you had 2 courses in philosophy you had to take. One was logic, because our journalism teachers felt that, if you're going to be a newspaper reporter, you really need to know something about logic. And then the other was an elective. So I took a course in the pre-Socratics. After that, I was seduced. I knew at 18 I had to do philosophy for the rest of my life. So as soon as I finished my, journalism degree, I worked on a couple of papers, Chicago Tribune. I was a stringer. I did an internship there in 68, I guess it was. And then a paper in Southern Illinois I worked on doing news stories, editorial, you name it, everything. So as soon as I finished my journalism degree, I went right back into grad school in philosophy and just stayed till I got my PhD.
Okay, so there are a few things I want to unpack there, because you are basically the same age as my mother. My mother was in Missouri in a Jim Crow segregated world, a very different world.
Yeah.
Where basically what was open to her was she had the principal called her into the office one day and said, "Would you like to be my maid?" Like that was the world that she lived in. So you had, as far as I know, and at least as far as my family is concerned, and the people I know, your existence was a lot different as a Black person at that time than a lot of people I know.
I know St. Louis, and because I went to Southern Illinois University, it's just a short drive. East St. Louis, for example.
Yeah.
And so I went to college actually with a wave of Black students, the first wave in 1966, in terms of the schools being integrated. But yeah, Evanston was uncharacteristic of a number of places. It was, I went to a high school that was integrated way back in the 30s. My mother graduated from it.
Wow.
Before I did. We had Black Americans who were largely craftspeople, electricians,
right.
Blue collar guys.
Yeah.
My great uncle he had a company called the Johnson Construction Company. All black. And he built churches and residences and apartment buildings all over my hometown. Now, what happened is he came from South Carolina in like the 30s or 40s. He first worked as a milkman in the Black community for a white milk company. But he worked construction, learned the ropes, and started his own company. Then he wrote back to his relatives, this is my great uncle, in South Carolina, and said, if you have any children who want to need a job, and this is the 30s and 40s, right? They come work for me. Dad was 25. He took up the offer. He moved from South Carolina to Evanston, worked for my great uncle, met my mom through another uncle of mine who met her first. That's how I came into the world.
Oh.
So because of the Johnson Construction Company. That's why on the title page of every one of my books, it says a work from the Johnson Construction Company.
Oh. Huh.
That's how they came about.
Oh, okay.
Evanston was different than a lot of, King came to Chicago in 1966, January. I was a senior. I remember it. It was his first Northern campaign. Right? He was directed to Chicago because of its segregation.
Right. Yeah.
Segregated cities in America. Right. So there's different arrangements that people had depending upon where they lived in respect to the falling away of something like legal segregation.
Yeah. And so I guess what I'm thinking about is you had a sense of the options you might have in the world in a way that I don't think my parents had, right? They weren't around Black people who did things and built things and made things. And so almost couldn't even imagine those things, I think.
Really? Yeah.
I'm not exactly. I mean, my mom had aspirations to do things. I don't mean that. But there didn't seem to be a path in the same way.
Mhm.
I experienced that later, much later in a different way, but there didn't seem to be these paths. When you decided not to be a cartoonist, although you became a cartoonist, when you decided not to study art, I should say, which is similar to my trajectory into becoming a writer in some ways, because I drew all the time.
Yeah.
And then I had a friend in, I think, 8th grade, 7th or 8th grade, who drew better than I did. And one day he said I could not draw.
Oh,
and I was devastated. And then one day he came to school and he had a drawing that he had done. And he said, Brian, can you come up with a story for this? And I said, what? And he says, you're so good at that.
Oh.
I had no idea I had any talent in that direction. So he did take something away from me. He gave me something else.
Wow. Yeah. No kidding.
Yeah. So, so it sounds like he's not a friend at first. He's a complicated guy. Yeah. And so I'm just thinking about, how early did you know you had a facility for writing?
I always had, art class in elementary school was where I shined. That was all I cared about was drawing, right? So I got patted on the head, by teachers and so forth. But what happened is literature. My literature classes, right, in high school, they fed my imagination. Mm-hmm. And we read all the important writers sort of at the time, right, in the 60s. So I relished those classes, and writing was easy for me.
Okay.
It wasn't difficult. I published my first 3 stories in the student newspaper's literary section. And those have been anthologized in books called First Words is one of them. It's the earliest writing, by writers that you know today. Mm-hmm. First Words by Paul Mandelbaum. He was the editor. But, so writing wasn't difficult. I had a different experience than you. You wanted to take a creative writing class, and some jerk teacher wouldn't let you do it. I was having lunch with a buddy. His name was Dick Bushnell, and there's a creative writing class that he wanted to take, and he wanted to have a friend in it. So I went along with him. I think we spent most of our time chatting and not listening to the teacher, Marie Claire Davis. She was publishing in the Saturday Evening Post at the time. She, her claim to fame, she did a history of the high school, and I just, I enjoyed her class. And then later, I set up an award in her name at the high school. It's been going for a long time now. It's called the Marie Claire Davis Award, and we give money, a certain amount of money, to the best student portfolio for a senior that year. But Marie, she took my stories and published them, because she was faculty supervisor for the student paper. So, okay, she's putting my stories in there. I was really still into drawing. That was my passion. But the two feed each other. The writing and the drawing, it's all stimulating the imagination. So I never saw myself as being somebody who was going to be a writer. I have friends, like the Stanley Crouch, who will say things like, knew he wanted to be a writer from the time he was in elementary school. I didn't. I knew I wanted to draw. I would make trips when I was in high school to New York, stay in Brooklyn with my relatives, and pound the pavement of Manhattan, going from one place to the other, one editor to another, seeing if I could get work. I was still in high school. I was a student correspondence course of Lawrence Laurier, who did the Best Cartoons of the Year. He published about 100 books of his own. He also wrote mystery stories under 3 pseudonyms. I would visit him on Long Island, and then I'd pound the pavement with my swatch, which was my, samples, right? I met, and people would let me in. I'm this kid from Illinois, right? 16, 17 years old. So they let me in, they talked to me. I wasn't getting any work in New York, okay, because it was all in-house and staff.
Right.
But I met Charles Barsotti, who published usually a lot in New Yorker, right? Barsotti. He was young then. I was a teenager. He must have been 20-ish. I remember something he said to me. He wrote to me later and said, there's a way there's something special you could do as a black cartoonist. In other words, subject matter that him and his white buddy cartoonist friends couldn't touch. And I didn't really think about that until I would say it was 1969. And Miri Baraka came and gave a lecture at the school I was at. And I remember he said to the students there, blacks, he wouldn't talk to white students at all. No questions, and he wouldn't answer them. He had two bodyguards on either side of him. And he read poetry, then he did a Q&A. He said to the black students, you should take your talent back to the black community. I felt he was talking to me. I went home to my dorm that night and spent a solid week drawing cartoons about black history, black culture. I just hadn't mined that material. The ideas just kept coming. And after a week, I went through like 2 bottles of India ink. I had a book, and I didn't know what to do with it. So I talked to my teachers in the journalism school. They didn't know what to do with it, but they got me an internship that following summer at the Chicago Tribune. So I go to the Tribune. I'm working on a column. It's a public service column called Action Express. And I also got to draw sometimes, for the column, right? Cartoons. Well, I walked down the hallway one day to the book editor. It was Bob Cromie. That was his name, Bob Cromie. And I said, I got this book I did of cartoons, and I don't know where to send it. Well, he said, you should go down to Johnson Publications. It's just right down the street on Michigan Avenue. These are the people who do Ebony and Jet, and all that. So I called them up and made an appointment, went over there, dropped off my manuscript, and about a week later, I get a call back from John H. Johnson's secretary, and they want to publish the book. And I said, well, cool. And I went by and I met the guy, John H. Johnson, shook his hand. He thought the cartoons were funny. And it came out in 1970 called Black Humor. And that was the same year I had a TV show called Charlie's Pad, where I drew 52 15-minute lessons teaching viewers how to cartoon. It was in the early days of PBS. It wasn't even called PBS. It's called educational TV. And when I was in college, I did everything for the town paper in terms of drawing, the Southern Illinoisan, the student paper. One day I was bored. I sent a letter to the local PBS station, WSIU-TV. I said, would you guys be interested in me doing a TV show? And I didn't expect to hear back. But this was the year after the Corporation for Public Broadcasting was formed. Okay. So stations all over the country needed content. So I went in, and they said, yeah, we'll do it, but PBS, we can't pay you. And so I said to myself, okay, I'm not getting paid, but do I want to do this? Yeah, I'll do this, just for the sake of doing it. Mm-hmm. So I learned how to be on camera for 52 15-minute episodes. It showed all over the place. It showed in Chicago. It showed in Boston.
What year was this?
1970.
I may have seen it.
Well, it showed all over the country because what stations could do, they could run one a week. That was my intention. Or they could put 2 together for a half-hour block. Mm-hmm. Or they could do an hour block. You could arrange the shows any way that you wanted to do it. And it was based on my lessons when I was 15 and 16 with Lawrence Larrier, who did all kinds of books, like I said. I based the show on his lessons. It's hard to find now. Because the reels, they got moved out of the station. And
oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah, I've got a sample reel with 3 shows on it, but I never look at it because it looks to me like I'm so young. It's like an animated high school photo. I can't look at this.
I understand.
So that was another life.
But it's fun. I really do think I may have seen it somewhere in the because I was 5 in 1970. So I drew all the time. So
you might have.
Yeah.
It showed in Canada. I think it was up. It popped up here and there for like 10 years.
Yeah.
I had moved on.
Sure.
Because after doing the 52 15-minute drawing lessons, I realized for the first time I don't really enjoy being in front of the camera. Mm-hmm. I like to be behind the camera writing. somebody else. I had no interest in being in front of the camera or being an actor or anything like that. And then years later, as it turns out, once I was at UW, I got hired in 1976, right? About the second quarter I was teaching, I got a call to write a docudrama about the oldest living American, Charlie Smith. He was 137, the oldest person on Social Security. And I wrote that show. It had Morgan Freeman in it. He had just come off the Electric Company.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, Glenn Turman was in it. Richard Ward, the late Richard Ward, played him. It was my first time writing for television, right? It was 90 minutes. And that led to 20 years of work, basically. I did about 20 teleplays and screenplays from that point, 1977 till the early 90s, I guess.
Okay. Wow. So I want to ask you about your approach to the work. When you started writing, what did you feel, or even now, how does it evolve? How do you feel about what your job is as a writer? What are you supposed to do as a writer? What is your job other than writing well? What are you doing?
Well, when I first started writing novels, it was like 1970, actually. I wrote 6 novels in 2 years. Remember, I was trained as a journalist.
Right.
I could produce copy, 10 pages a day, 5 days a week. You do that, you got a book manuscript, and a 10-week quarter. I mean, basically, that's, and that was first draft for me. 10 pages a day, take off time on the weekend.
I want to stop you for a second, because being a journalist, something happens you write about. Being a novelist, nothing happens when you write about it, right? So you know what I mean? Like you're generating material. It's different than reporting.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But I had the work ethic.
Okay.
But let me point this out. Those I call apprentice novels. They were 6 in 2 years. And the last 3 were a trilogy. I wanted, this is a young man's folly. I was going to write a trilogy about a musician. And I had a buddy who was a musician, gave me lessons on the piano. The first book was called Youngblood. And he's a young boy learning how to be a pianist. And then the second book, he's a grown man. Third one, he's middle-aged. Now, that was the last 3. Now, one of the earlier ones, the earlier 3, was an earlier version of Middle Passage.
Okay.
And I started doing research with before I graduated. I was still in my senior year, and we had a visiting professor who was black from St. Louis, because we had no black professors. And I took his course, and I asked him if I could do my research on the Middle Passage. He said, sure. So I used that when I turned to the novel. Now, but let me tell you something else, too. When I went to college, there were no black teachers. So around 1969, I guess it was, the graduate students from different departments, one was a friend of mine, Tom Slaughter, in philosophy. He taught the logic class. He was TA. So he was TA for the discussion group of the logic class that I took. So I knew Tom all the way through undergraduate school. We both got our PhDs at Stony Brook University, did our dissertations with phenomenologist Don Idy. But back then, I was undergraduate, he was a grad student. The grad students got together and put together a course, a survey of Black America history and so forth. And they would give lectures, and they selected 10 of us, undergraduates, to be discussion group leaders. So that year, I prepared for my class. I read everything I could. I read all of From Slavery to Freedom by John Hope Franklin, that big thick book, so I could prepare for my discussion group, right? Well, and that was the beginning of Black American studies at that school, right? But so what they did was they brought in a visiting professor at one point, and I took his course. and I did my early research on Middle Passage. It was the second of the 6 books that I tried to write, but I wasn't ready to write. I read everything conceivable about literature and aesthetics that I could in that period, right? During that 2-year period, anything that had to do with writing. I was building a library. But each one of the books, I learned something. The first book wasn't good. It was about my experiences in Chicago in a martial arts school. And it's called The Last Liberation. But I wasn't ready to do it. But what I learned from the first book, I could put together 250 pages of something. If I could do it once, I could do it again.
Right.
I went to the second book, and then the third book. And each one, let's say characterization wasn't working. I worked on that in the next book. Description wasn't as up to par as it should be. I worked on that in the next book. 6 books like that, apprentice novels, teaching myself how to write. With the 7th book, which became Faith in the Good Thing, my first published book, I became a student of the late writer John Gardner, who was at the school, and he became probably the best teacher of creative writing, literary fiction, in our time. He did 3 books very important: The Art of Fiction, On Moral Fiction, and On Becoming a Novelist.
I want to stop you for a second. I want to go back to something.
Okay.
So when you talk about writing those apprentice novels, there's an interesting thing. I read an interview years ago with Frank Darabont talking about writing Shawshank and the screenplay. And he said, I can't remember what the context was or why he brought it up, but he said, you have to write 5 screenplays before you write a good one.
Okay.
You have to write 5.
Yeah.
And I remember, oh yeah, I've done that. You know, I've written that many, or whatever it was at the time I'd written. And that seems right. And what I find is when I tell people that, because when people write a screenplay, they think, well, I've written a screenplay, point me in the direction of Steven Spielberg. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? They don't understand that it's a craft and that it takes time and that you have to work at it. And that first thing is probably not so great. So, but they don't understand that because it's often so hard to get that first one out.
It is, yeah.
That they think they've really, and it is an accomplishment, but it isn't the accomplishment that they think it is.
Exactly.
And I say to people, well, if it bothers you, if it scares you that you have to write 5 of these before you get good at it, you probably shouldn't do it. You're not prepared to do the work it takes to get good at this. Mm-hmm. And that's fine. That's not a crime. There's plenty of things I would like to do. I don't want to do the work to get good at them. That's why I don't play a musical instrument. That's why I don't speak another language, right? I don't want to stumble through it, but I know that, so I'm fine with it. But people who don't want to stumble through something really can't master it, because writing those novels without getting published and knowing where the faults were and still writing, that's
let me pick up on something I said. The last 3 I told you were going to be a trilogy, a 1,000-page story, right?
Yeah.
A Young Man's Folly. The first book in that series, Youngblood, was accepted by a New York startup publisher. And I'm working on the 7th book with John Gardner at the time, Faith in the Good Thing. I got 2 chapters. I don't know if I could even finish it. But here was a bird in the hand. Here was acceptance of this book, Youngblood. But the problem was, for me, I'd moved on. My goal was to write philosophical fiction, to fill that void that I think we have in American literature for philosophical, works that probe perennial questions. I was just beginning to find how to do that. My voice, it had a storyteller voice too, Faith in the Good Thing. So I turned to John Gardner and I said, look, I got an acceptance. Everybody wants to get published. What do I do? Because this isn't me anymore. See, you always write like who you read.
Right.
I was under the influence of naturalistic writers who I admired, like Baldwin, John A. Williams, black writers who wrote in the naturalistic vein. But with Faith in the Good Thing, I take a fabulous, magical, some people would call it magic realism approach. So I said, this other book is not me. So he said something very wise. He said, if you think you're going to have to climb over it later, don't publish it.
Mm.
So I wrote to them and asked for the book back. And I'm glad that I did.
Wow.
Because, your debut novel is very important. Because, you've been working hard, writing. Nobody just shows up having written a book overnight. This person has probably been writing for a while.
Right.
It's their debut book. Here's what's going to happen. People are going to size you up on the basis of that. 80% of first novelists do not publish another novel. So the critics are going to say, this person's good at this, has these virtues. This is a writer to watch. Okay, you broke the ice, you got your first book out. The second book is equally important because it says three things. One, I'm going beyond the first book in terms of what, my ambitions, what I'm going to cover. Secondly, the first book was not a fluke.
Right.
I'm not just a one book author, This and the third thing it says, I'm here to stay.
Mm-hmm.
You get really good reviews on the second book, then they'll give you a kind of break, for the third one, right? You can do whatever you want, but you got to demonstrate that you are serious. You're here to stay in terms of American literature, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, when I mentioned the 6 books prior to the 7th, when I worked on with John Gardner, I didn't know how to revise the first 6. I'd write through and then go back to the beginning and write through again. I was working with Gardner, and he's looking at one of my chapters, and he's making suggestions. And I say, oh, okay, well, I'll take care of that when I get to the end of the book. I'll deal. He said, no, you can't do that. You have to make it right now.
Yeah.
Before you go ahead.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, I've tried 6 books. My approach, let me try this. So my process of revision changed. I dig deeper into the first draft pages and basically deeper and deeper in terms of delineating character and background and setting and music. You want music and meaning. You want sound and sense. When you do that, you're pushed into the next paragraph and the next page rather than writing the whole thing out, and then going back and trying. No, that doesn't work for me. So my process of revision is such that I will throw away 20 pages to get one. Faith in the Good Thing, I threw out 1,200 pages. The second book, Oxherding Tale, 2,000 pages. The third book was Middle Passage. That was 3,000 pages. Dreamer after that was 3,000 pages as well. My ratio of throwaway to keep can be 20-1. I keep all the drafts in a box and I count them, when I'm done.
Can I ask you about what are you throwing away? What's happening there? Why is it 20-1? What are you throwing away and what are you keeping, and how do you make that decision about what you're throwing away and what you're keeping?
Well, I'm constantly revising. Even as I push forward with new pages, right? I'm revising the earlier material too. You can look at my book that I did, The Way of the Writer. Mm-hmm. I have a chapter there on the process of moving from one draft to the other in that particular book on the writing craft. Sometimes it could be a major rewrite. When I did Middle Passage, I started in 83, finished in 89, and it was published in 1990, right? I wrote the first draft in 2 years. That was too fast. Mm-hmm. It was way too fast. So I had to back up. And during that period of time, now I had spent 17 years accumulating research and information on the North Atlantic slave trade. But the first time I tried to do it, like I said, when I was an undergraduate, I wasn't ready.
Right.
I come back to it in 83 after doing
Wait, I'm going to stop you again. When you say you weren't ready, what do you mean?
Oh, I didn't have the craft, the skill.
Okay.
I first started writing, at the first draft of this in like 71.
Okay.
So I come back to it in 83. By that time, I've got the research because I've been doing a lot of stuff, PBS drama, slave dramas, getting research. I did Booker, which got a Writers Guild Award in 1985, the best script in the children's show category, and it got a lot of awards, but it also got that Writers Guild Award over there. I mean, when you do something like that, the producers get historians to work with you. You get lots of material, And so I was always studying the slave period. But this time, I wanted to do what hadn't been done, which is a novel that puts us on those ships, during the Middle Passage.
Yeah.
Every conceivable detail that I could get out of it. But even more important, I conceived of it as a rousing sea adventure story. So during that 7 years I was working on it, 6 years, I read every sea story I could get my hands on. I read all of Melville, but not for story. I read them for props, for costuming, for parts of, the ships, right?
Uh-huh.
I read the Sinbad stories. I read 2 Years Before the Mast. Every sea story I could possibly absorb in 6 years, I did. So after 2 years, it was too fast, so I backed up. And actually, if you know the novel, there's a mutiny by the slaves. That was in the first 2 years I figured that out. When I came back to it, I realized there's going to be a mutiny among the crew against the captain. So we got 2 mutinies going on. Secondly, when I wrote the end of the first version of this, the main character, Rutherford Calhoun, survives the wreck of the Republic with the cabin boy. And they go back to New Orleans looking for the woman he left New Orleans with because he didn't want to get married, right?
Right.
So he jumps on his ship, doesn't know it's a slave ship. So he goes from the frying pan into the fire. Well, he goes back looking for her, but she's not there. And what has happened in that version is his brother in Southern Illinois has come looking for him in New Orleans. He meets Isadora. They're perfect for each other. And so one day, Rutherford's walking down the street with Tommy, the cabin boy, and he sees a baptism going on, something like that. So he sticks his head in the church. It's his brother and Isadora, and they've had a baby. And they're naming the baby after Rutherford, who they figured was lost at sea. Now, these are the 2 people he loves most in the world. Most in the world, his brother and Isadora. But he thinks about it and he says, I could interrupt this and say, hey, I'm alive. I survived. But guess what? They're perfect for each other. So he decides to go back to sea with Tommy. Well, I didn't like that because a couple of things had to happen. One, he has to be reunited with Isadora, who he saw, was trying to get him to marry her in the beginning. Critics have said this about this book, Middle Passage. It starts out as a picaresque because Rutherford's a picaro. And then it turns into an epic when you're at sea, right? It's a sea epic. And it finally comes to rest at the end as a romance. So we've got to get those 2 back together because he's Odysseus and she's Penelope, okay?
Right.
So I rewrote it that way. So once we leave Africa, also in the earlier version, I had them wandering, and they go to an island where I create a whole bunch of people. See, the working title for Middle Passage was Rutherford's Travels, because I wanted in the spirit of Gulliver's Travels.
Yeah. So
they go to an island. The Africans have taken over the ship, and they meet these weird people, and it's no good. So when I rewrote it, once they leave Africa, they never set foot on land. And the reason for that is you have to have the chronic tension of the possibility of dying at sea. And so he's never touching land until even the end of the book. He's still on another ship where he's reunited with Isadora, right? You see the principle here? The principle is the things that you set up in the very beginning of the book, right? You might want to say Act 1 or something like that. What you've done in that, you can do anything you want in Act 1 at the beginning of a story, but you are despoiling possibilities.
Right.
So what you want is an inexorable cause and effect feeling right all the way through the story. It's unpacking the implications of everything that you've established in the beginning. That's the logic, that we have to maintain. If we veer away from that, if we get, novelists, by the time you get to the end of a novel, you're tired. After
Right, yeah.
years and 3,000 pages, you just want to wrap this thing up, okay? But no, you can't do that. Every plot, and I'm quoting John Gardner now, is the writer's equivalent to the philosopher's argument. Your plot is based on causation. This causes that.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, the drama you're constructing is an argument.
Yeah. So is that, what did you, when you were learning from John Gardner, what was important to him as a teacher to impart? And what did you find important to impart to your students? What you taught for 35 years or something?
Yeah.
So what did you learn? What did you take?
33 years.
33 years. So what did you take from John Gardner?
When I first met him, I was working part-time on a newspaper called the Southern Illinoisan to put myself through the master's program in philosophy. And I opened the paper one day, and I see an ad for professional writing taught by this guy Gardner. I'd heard about him. Mm-hmm. Friends of mine who were English majors took his classes, and there were all kinds of stories about him, circulating on campus. I didn't know the guy, but I want to start my 7th novel. So I call him up, and I said, can I get in your class? I'm a grad student in philosophy. He said, sure, come by my farmhouse. So I go by the farmhouse with 6 books under my arm. And it's the first meeting. It's a beginning class. I really don't need to be there. So afterwards, I said to him, I want to, I said a couple of things. But he looked at the 6 books, and he said, what do you want from me? You can write. And I said, yeah, I can write. I mean, I can produce copy. But I'm hearing from some editors, there's 2 areas where I can improve, voice and rhythm. And he said, I can help you with that. And he could. He was a prose stylist. The music of his prose is there in Grindel and in many, many of his works. So I told him, look, I'm going to come to your office when I've got something to show you. I'm not going to come to this beginning class here. So voice and rhythm, just by reading his works carefully, is something that I took away from Gardner. Also, his work ethic. This guy can write for 72 hours straight without sleep. Mm-hmm. If it were not for Gardner, I really wouldn't have read medieval literature, but I did, and took a course of his on the epic, because he wrote an epic called Jason and Medea, and co-taught a course on the epic with other people. So, I'm reading Virgil, and I'm reading Homer, and I'm reading, the history of the epic. He was a scholar. He was also a musician, played the libretto. He was a polymathic, creator. And that inspired me, because like Lawrence Laurier, I like artists who are prolific and produce a lot and are always working. If you're going to be a novelist, you're in this for the long haul. You're going to be learning across I've been publishing drawings and stories for 55 years, since 1967 when I was 17. You're always learning with each new work that you do. Why? Because it's not the same as the last one. There's 2 things that happen that are really important. One is problem solving. With each new work, it's a different set of creative problems. Secondly, discovery. You discover something during the creation of this gift that you're going to give to others, because that's the way I see it. I don't do this for money. I don't do this for fame. Screw all that. This is my best technique, my best thought, my best feeling, the best I can give to others. So if it takes 6 years, fine. If it takes 7 years, that's how long I worked on Dreamer. 7 years, the novel about Martin Luther King, because he doesn't appear as a character in our literature. Mm-hmm. He doesn't. He's not there, and especially not the philosophical king, right? So there's, you need to study literature to see what's been done by your predecessors. Learn how they solve problems creatively that you yourself are going to face, right? And then you know what to do next to enrich that literature. So, I learned a certain way it was already in me, because I was a cartoonist, and I published hundreds, if not thousands of drawings, right? So I could see how you do that through John with writing.
Okay.
Okay, because I was already prepared as a journalist and cartoonist, right? So I made the transition to using the same 24/7 approach as a writer. And when I say you're in for a long haul, I mean this. The late Jacob Lawrence, the painter, my former colleague at UW, he was painting to the last day of his life. You know, August Wilson, our mutual friend, he did 10 plays, his cycle, you know, the Century Cycle. But I know he wanted to write a novel after completing
he said that,
the 10 plays. And had he lived, he would still be working to this very day.
Yeah, he told me he was going to retire. He goes, I'm going to retire because then there's no pressure. And then I can produce what I want to produce.
Yeah.
But he was going to keep working.
Well, that's what he told me too.
Yeah.
He was going to announce, I'm retiring.
Yeah.
The reporters would go away.
Yeah.
He could sit on his porch on Capitol Hill, read all the books he could never have a chance to get to.
Yeah.
He's producing a play like every 2 years.
Yeah, it was insane how much
he could play with his daughter. He was going to play with his daughter. And he was going to do like Eugene O'Neill when he supposedly retired.
That's what he said to me too.
After 10 years, come back with 3 of the best plays you could ever imagine.
Yeah, that's what
that was what his plan was going to be. And a novel. So yeah, I mean, if you're an artist, you're in this 24/7.
Yeah. This idea of voice, here's the interesting thing for me about voice. When I'm talking to students, it's almost, they don't get the craft part first, right? So what they want to do is be different first, or they want to find their, when people say find your voice, it becomes an affect for a young writer, right? Like I'll do it like this, I'll do it like that. When you hear that, or when you tell somebody that, or when you were hearing that, how do you interpret that? I have a way that I interpret it, but I want to know how you interpret it.
Find your own voice?
Yeah. What does that mean?
I have a lot of thoughts about that. I think voice and vision are two sides of the same phenomenon. The reason young writers don't have a voice yet is because they don't have a vision of how life works yet. They're too young. They don't have enough experience. Once you discover what you really feel, your voice becomes the vehicle for delivering that vision, that you have. It takes a while, in other words, to develop, a voice. Now, one of the things I do, I picked this up from Gardner too. It's called narrative ventriloquism. You change voices from story to story, particularly in first person. The diction, the rhythm, the music for each speaker in a first person story had better be different, right? Based on who your protagonist narrator is.
Sure.
But I feel you should have that same sense of voice in third person limited stories as well. Voice is extremely important. So narrative ventriloquism, you'll see it in my 4 story collections, particularly the last one, Nighthawks. Those stories are all over space and time. They go always back to ancient India, the Athenians. They move forward in time, even to a story set in the future, as well as stories set here in Seattle with Black characters, with characters who are Muslim Americans. In other words, there is no limit, right? Because each one of us, now think about this, has many voices inside of us. Each one of us can be a mimic, has many voices. You could put on a mask. It's like, it's like you're doing your characters. It's like a Punch and Judy show. And you're changing voices for the characters as you go back and forth, right? But then I have my own voice. And that usually appears in the nonfiction I do. I mean, I've published 25 books. There's 2 more in the pipeline. They're both graphic novels, right? But the body of my work, is a lot of it, because I'm a philosopher, is nonfiction. And so I don't change my voice there. And, the diction that I use, the word choice, it's just me. Some writers never change. And And I'm thinking, D.H. Lawrence does not change voices in his novels and stories. P.G. Wodehouse does not change voices, in his novels. Kurt Vonnegut doesn't change voices. Why? It's because we like that voice. It's Vonnegut's voice. Now, that's why you go to the novel, because you want to hear Vonnegut's voice delivering the story, right?
Right.
But I'm a little bit different. I, like Gardner, would do narrative ventriloquism in my fiction, novels and stories, but not in the essays, not in the nonfiction.
It's almost like a certain kind of actor, right? There are actors.
Yes.
I love Tom Hanks. I got nothing bad to say about Tom Hanks. Tom Hanks is always Tom Hanks. I believe him in every movie that he's in. I believe he's in that circumstance. That's Tom Hanks doing this. That's Tom Hanks doing this. And I believe it, and I buy it, and I'm invested. But it's not the same as Gary Oldman, who's a chameleon.
Yes.
Right? Right? And sometimes people think one skill set is more than another, and I don't think that that's true. I just think that they are just different skill sets. Like, the fact that Gary Oldman is a chameleon is just that he's a chameleon, and that's the way that in a way is his voice, right? Right.
Yeah.
No,
I know exactly what you're talking about. The individual actor disappears into the character he's playing from one film to the next, as opposed to the actor who's playing himself in different roles of situation, different actors.
In different circumstances. It's like, well, this is Tom Hanks in this circumstance, right? But for me, when I hear find your voice, it's really about, and maybe this is what you were saying, finding out who you are.
Yes.
Right? And being honest about who you are.
Yes.
And your voice comes out of that because it's not an affectation.
No, not at all.
So
I would simply add that to find your voice is to find your vision, how you see the world.
Yeah.
And that takes time. I mean, it's really rare for a 20-year-old to, have been bumped around enough in life to have a certain sense of authority.
Right.
Based on experience, because they haven't had the experience yet. And they haven't read enough yet in literature, history, it takes time.
Right. And just living life,
exactly.
Just being alive will teach you things.
Yep.
And it's patterns. Life is patterns, right? So that you say, oh, this is how this goes. I've seen this before, right? And so now you have a sense. Now everybody's going to see different things, but at least they're seeing patterns, and those patterns give you a sense of what the world is like. Now it's going to be different for you than me. It's going to be we're born at different times, at different places, or whatever it is. So we may look at the same events differently, but we're seeing clear patterns, and it's the ability to see those patterns over time that allows you to draw conclusions, I think, that then gives you your voice.
That sounds pretty good to me. Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, I used something of yours the other day, which was you talked about stories being like a funnel.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Which I find really useful. I was giving a presentation, and I'm like, hey, a friend of mine says this. Can you explain that, just so that because it's on my mind because I had just used it? But
well, yeah, I remember drawing that funnel on the blackboard for my students. You started with the big end of the funnel. When you start your story, you can do anything. You can set it anywhere. You can make your character tall, short, male, female. But what it is you despoil possibilities with every decision that you make, right? In the first part of the story. So in the first part of the story, you're in the realm of the possible. By the time you get to the middle of the story, after despoiling more and more details, you're in the realm of the probable. And you set this up yourself by the details that you selected, right? But you move from the possible to the probable. And then the third part of the story, it's the realm of of necessity.
Right.
Certain things are not going to happen because of the way you've despoiled possibilities for this character.
Right.
It's much narrower at the end.
Yeah.
Only certain, in terms of cause and effect, only certain things can come about.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's like a funnel in that sense.
Yeah. I always think of it as story math, I call it. That the story math can only add up to a certain thing at the end, or it's not working, right? So if your story math is off, it's like, well, everything you said doesn't equal this.
That's right.
Right.
No, that's a great way to put it, because when you get to that third part, the realm of necessity, when the funnel is very small, you can't just have any old thing happen.
No.
You can't just throw any old thing you want into that.
No.
It's not going to work. It has to proceed with profluence, with cause and effect from everything that came before, if it's going to be logical.
Right.
If the viewer or the reader is not going to say, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. This character would not do that, or you've got to do a deus ex machina.
Right.
You solve the problem by the machine of the gods who just come in and magically. No, it can't happen that way. At least not in what we typically call a naturalistic story. However, even if you're doing fantasy, you lock yourself in.
Oh, yeah.
Beginning. You made decisions, about something, about what a dragon is like.
Yeah.
By the middle of the story, you cannot change what the rules are that you set up. If you say a dragon can only breathe fire when he hiccups, and he breathes fire in the middle of the story, he's not hiccuping.
Yeah.
No, that doesn't make sense. You just contradicted yourself, right?
Yeah. You have to play by the rules you establish.
Exactly, yes.
And actually that becomes, sometimes it's challenging, but that's where the fun comes in. Actually, sometimes working within those boundaries and doing something unexpected often within those constraints.
Discovering something.
Yeah.
Unexpected that you didn't know would be there before.
Right. Yeah. I always tell people that the solution to their story problems is always inside the story. They don't have to go outside the story to find the solution. Often people are like, what if I bring this in? What if I bring this in? It's like, no, it's already in there. It's already in there. Just look inside your story.
I used to tell students when they got to the end of a story and they were having trouble, the reason is because they did not set up things right in the first part of the story.
Yeah.
So they may have to go back in and rebuild something in order to get that result that they want at the end. So it has a logical feel. It's an argument, a dramatic argument, and it has coherence. What we do when we tell stories is we interpret the world for others. That's what's happening. We're interpreting human experience for other people. That means that we're hopefully bringing clarity to human experience, right? So yeah, it's all there in the beginning. And that's where you really want to front load your energies. And then by the time you get to the end, you're just, it's like you're a reporter.
Yeah.
You're just playing and just going through what must happen and just describing it.
That's it. It's fun. I spend a lot of time when I'm teaching on the first act and explaining how important it is and trying to get people to understand how to make a solid, strong first act. Yes. And often people will say, well, that's fine, but how do I do the second and third act? Now, it's not like I ignore those things, but it's like, you don't understand. I'm telling you about the foundation of if you can do this, you can do the other things.
That's right.
But this is the foundation you're building on. Well, it's really confusing to people, but that's just how it works. I don't know.
You're one of the finest teachers of story that I know in my personal experience.
Thank you.
You never say anything wrong. I remember when I first met you, my thought was, wait a minute, this guy sounds like me. But he's more clear than I am. Who is this Brian McDonald? Invisible ink is just, it's golden, man. It's a gift. It's a gift to everybody who wants to write in that medium of film. But the principles are the same for any form of storytelling, really. I would add, when I talk to students, what I really want them to understand is, first of all, you need to know what the ground situation is. Mm-hmm. Some people would call that the conflict, but it's the ground situation that the characters are in. But even more important is character. Character is the engine of plot. Mm-hmm. You don't have stock characters. You have individual characters who, based on their history, their place in society, who the mom was and their dad was. This is an individual character who is not going to do certain things, and you can't force that on them as the writer.
Yeah.
Then you see the heavy hand of the writer manipulating them like a puppet. So you dig deep into character, and then, it's a little cliche, several characters in the novel, it's like they take over and, they take the story away from you. That's what you usually mean by that. You can't violate characters who you've given lots of depth and density to in the beginning.
Well, it's come up now on a couple of these episodes, but I think it's appropriate in this instance too to talk about this. The best piece of writing advice I ever got. Do you know this? So I was at a comic book convention when I was a teenager, and there was a panel of writers and artists from comic books. And this one writer, I think it was Steve Englehart, said as a piece of advice, he says, well, if you have a Batman story and you can make it a Superman story, it's not a good Batman story. Oh. And that was the best piece of advice I ever got about writing.
That's interesting.
Because what that says is only this character can have this story.
Yes.
Right?
That is incredibly important.
Yeah.
You have to understand your protagonist for sure.
Yeah.
But, you're going to have other characters too. And they're going to, they're going to be round. That's the way we used to talk about it.
Yeah.
As opposed to flat.
Right.
A flat character is not changing. It has to be there, as the person who sells the newspaper to the protagonist when he needs to read the news. He's not changing. But the thing about your main character, your protagonist, is he or she is in a process of change and evolution through that funnel. Now, let me elaborate on that just a little bit more, because I would tell this to my students too. This character that you created is not coming out the end of the story as clean as they were when we saw them in the beginning. The whole purpose is for them to evolve. This is why you choose this moment in the character's life, because the character is living for high stakes.
Right.
Something is going to change.
Yeah.
Right? It has to change. And so the reader will follow this character then through that process of evolution to the end. They will not be the same. Now, in formula fiction, yeah, they probably are. James Bond doesn't change very much from one James Bond story. But if you're talking about literary fiction and real, film, I'm saying cinema, that character is being forced because of the ground situation at this moment in his or her life to confront something of major importance to them. And we will see how they deal with that.
William Goldman, the screenwriter and novelist, actually, William Goldman says that a movie is the most important 2 hours of a character's life.
Yes.
And that's a really great way to think about it.
That is a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
It isn't a casual, ordinary moment, because that's going to be boring, right?
Right.
You've chosen the moment where this character has to confront something. One of the things I used to tell my students, and it's in the book too, The Way of the Writer, when you're looking at your character and trying to figure out who she is or he is, one of the things you want to ask yourself is, what is their greatest fear? And I don't mean snakes or spiders like Indiana Jones.
Right.
I mean their greatest social fear.
Right.
One thing in life, they would rather die than not have to endure.
Yep.
You put them in that situation then.
Yep.
And see what happens.
Yep.
They're either going to break or they're going to change and survive it, endure.
Yeah.
You got to figure out what is their greatest social fear. And what that means for the student in the class, they know what it means. I got to figure out my greatest social fear.
Yeah.
Right? What am I most afraid of? What do I dread the most? And okay, maybe that's what my character dreads.
Yeah, I often have people I won't have them share it, but I have them write it down. What's the worst thing you can imagine confronting or happening to you? What's the last thing you don't even want to think about it so bad?
Exactly.
Right. You don't even want to think about it. And then I give them a few minutes to do that. And when they've done that, I say, that's exactly what your characters have to go through. Something that intimate and that frightening.
That's right.
You know? Yeah, you have to go to that place. And I find with writers, often they don't want to put their characters through too much trouble. They get attached to people and they're like, oh, that seems like a lot. And they'll avoid conflict, right? Because they like this character. And it doesn't have to be that bad. It's like, you know, instead of their child dying, maybe their child could get sick. It's like, you know what I mean? That kind of thing. They pull back, they pull back. And I'm finding over and over again, that's one of the hardest things for people is to go to that place.
It is. It's a tender place. It's a vulnerable place. You have to make yourself vulnerable to go there. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people don't want to do that. Because you're confronting something about yourself, and indeed about the character too. It takes hard work emotionally to do this. Why? Because you're being emotionally honest. That's what's happening. Yeah. You know, this is a chance in a person's life when you can do that. You know, maybe you can't go out in the street and do that, but here on the page, you can go to those places and see what's going to happen. It's almost the way John Gardner used to put it. I thought it was kind of interesting. You know, take Crime and Punishment, right? And what's on Raskolnikov's mind? There is no God. And if there is no God, I can do anything. I can go kill this old woman over here, okay? And what'll happen if I do that? Now, that's an experiment. Now, most of us are not going to go out and kill an old woman to see what the result's going to be. But you can do it in fiction, and you can trace what happens to him, after this act, and then the consequences thereof. Through fiction, we can go to places safely and explore them emotionally, intellectually, that we normally can't do in our ordinary life and wouldn't do.
Right. Yeah. But I think it allows a reader then, or a viewer, to have the benefit again of that. I've talked about this before, but the benefit of that experience without going through it, right? So there's a thought experiment where they go, okay, I probably shouldn't go around killing people, right? You know what I mean? If I draw it out, if I did the story math, right? It's like, and I think we all do it anyway in our regular lives when we weigh options. We are doing story math. Well, if I do this, what's the cause? What's the cause and effect? This is the cause. This is the effect. This is the cause. This is the effect. And then you follow it, and you go, that's probably not a good decision. Or if your story math is off, you often make a horrible decision, right? Right. But I think it's not different. I think that this line, in a lot of ways, between a created story or a piece of fiction and our lives is not a very hard line. And it's kind of a soft line. And so what you're doing is you may be distilling your experiences and your philosophies into this story, but they don't only exist there, right?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
There's implications.
Yeah.
Our lives, for our lived experience, outside the novel or the story or the film. And stories have been used that way for the longest time. Think about Aesop. Think about the animal fables, that we have, the Jataka tales in the East, or Aesop, teaching stories. And that's like people sitting around a fire, maybe in prehistoric times, and somebody's telling a story. Yeah. And the others are listening very carefully, because they're probably wondering, what if I was in that situation? Would I do what this character is going to do? In other words, you learn from art, literary art or storytelling.
I think so. I mean, I think that's what they exist for. I believe that in my bones, that's why they exist. That's why we crave them. That's why you can't go through a day without them. It's like food. I think it serves almost exactly the same function and probably is as important as food. If you didn't have food and you didn't have a way to get food, you would try to think of stories that you knew about how people got food. If I was trapped on an island, I'm like, what have I seen? What have I read about people trapped on islands? Right?
Yeah.
That's what I would do. That's what we do, I think.
Well, no, our minds are structured such that we organize our experience in terms of narratives, beginning, middles, and ends. It's probably an artificial structure that we impose upon the world, but there is something here in our minds that naturally shapes experience in this fashion as a story. Again, even those basic terms, right? A beginning, something has a beginning and a middle and an end. That isn't necessarily what you see out here in nature, okay? With a beginning, middle, and end. That is what we impose on all of experience. So we're built to do this. Now, as a Buddhist, that's one of the things I have to decondition myself about. Now, that may sound like a strange thing to say, but we can be seduced by our stories because they're very powerful. But one of the things we do in meditation, and I sat before I hooked up with you guys. I always do that before I do a public anything. One of the things is get the stories out of my head so that they are not in the way of me seeing what is right in front of me. They are not making me prejudge things or make assumptions about things, just to let things be. And then, try to see what's there right here, right now, not telling a story about it. Okay. But letting it, because we can do that in a dangerous way. We can look at a present event and think of a past story and impose that on the present event. And I'm thinking of slavery. When we look at an event in the present time, in 2020, but we interpret it in terms of something in the 19th century, that can be problematic. Because this ain't then. That was 2 centuries ago.
Right.
If that makes sense. This is not the 60s either. So I don't think we can impose that interpretation on a present event and really appreciate the present event in all of its uniqueness.
That sounds like a history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes thing, where it's not the 60s, but are there things from the 60s and stories from the 60s that might inform how we operate going forward? Well,
I think it's very important to understand the past.
Yeah.
I mean, history is very, very important. I'm not blind to it, but neither am I bound by it. I really think we need to look carefully at every situation and careful about the language that we use. For a Buddhist who practices the Eightfold Path, it's called right speech. It's right speech. And we are artists and we are storytellers. We shape people's thoughts and feelings through, what we do. Language is powerful. It's powerful. It's a tool we have to use with care.
I used to live near a West African shaman, and when he found out I was a writer, he said, "Oh, you're a writer." He said, "Words are the first magic," is what he told me. They make things happen. They make
Yes.
They make things real. They can make things real.
Yeah.
Words, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I see that.
As a matter of fact, I was just reading about this, and I had read something about this before and seen a documentary about the Himba tribe in, I think they're in West Africa. I don't know if you know, but so it was a documentary that I saw about color and how we see color. And they think the way we see color has to do with language and how we categorize color. So what they did is they went to the Himba, who have a different way of categorizing color than we do. And so they, for instance, we'd say the sky is blue, they say the sky is black. We would say that water's blue, they say water's white. and they categorize differently. And so they showed the Himba this screen of green squares with one blue square. They're completely confused by it because they don't have a category that separates blue from green.
Oh, I see.
But you can show them a bunch of green squares with one that's slightly off, and they can pick it out like that.
Mm-hmm.
Because they have a name for all those different colors of green.
I see what you're saying. Okay.
Right? So it helps them see differently.
The language.
Right, the language. And then I was just recently reading that in Russian, because of the way they categorize blue, they see more colors in a rainbow. Rainbows are thicker. There's more colors that are invisible to us because we don't categorize them.
Well, this reminds me of a thought that I've had really going back to, when I was an undergraduate. It's a variation on the Eskimo, seeing all these kinds of snow that we don't normally see because we don't live that close to snow, right?
Right.
In other words, the language gives us, well, it can give us a perception, I guess, by focusing our intentionality, the way we aim at something. I go back and forth in my mind on this because I read, and they're probably wrong now, when I was undergraduate, scholars talking about the ancient Athenians and how they didn't see blue because they didn't describe it in any of their plays or works of art. So does that mean they didn't see blue? I don't know. I mean, I can't.
I just recently read that again, so that's what they think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's speculative, but it's an interesting thought to entertain.
Mm-hmm.
Our perceptual apparatus as humans is probably pretty similar across the last 2,000 years, but we know with other species, if you're a dog lover like I am, you know the subtlety with which they hear, and we don't, and smell things that we don't. So other species experience the world out there differently than we do. But does culture among our species, as we go from culture to culture and language system to language system, does that affect our perceptual experience too? I haven't seen anything really conclusive on this, empirical, that just nails it. Mm-hmm. Is it the case, because you're talking about Russians, right?
Yeah.
That they have a richer rainbow experience than we do.
Yeah.
How do you prove that? How do you test that?
Well, that's one of the problems they have with things like color. That's what it's like, well, how do you prove it? But there's a lot of things about consciousness you can't prove, right? I can't prove you're conscious. Mm-hmm. Right? I can't prove that you are conscious. I know I'm conscious. I can't prove you're conscious. Right.
I could be a robot. No, conscious. But see that this is why I focused my graduate work on phenomenology, because it is a philosophy of consciousness. Everything that we experience is delivered to us through the mind, through consciousness. So I've always had that as an interest, and you find that in Buddhist practice as well. It's all about the mind and how it operates and so forth. From an Eastern perspective, however, if you look at early Buddhism, it really has the flavor and feel of a proto-phenomenology. But again, we're talking about what delivers the world to us. That thing is consciousness, the mind.
You talk about philosophical novels.
Yes.
What do you mean?
I mean novels that explore ideas. I mean novels that pick up perennial questions in the human experience, from East or West. Every one of my novels has a philosophical question at the core. Now, I told you the first one, published one, is Faith in the Good Thing. The central question there that I keep coming back to again and again is faith in the good thing. What is the good? That's Plato's question. What is the good? The second novel, Ox-Herding Tale, that's my Buddhist novel set in the slavery era. The question there is, what is the self? Middle passage, for Rutherford Calhoun and the Africans on the ship, the question is, where is home? Where is home? And the last novel I did, Dreamer, which is a civil rights movement in King, the fundamental question is, how do we end social evil without creating social evil? Now, I raise the question so I can explore it. I don't come to a conclusion to shut the question down, but rather allow the drama to let the reader experience palpably the question. Here, let me put it this way for you. I don't think ideas begin up in the ether, in some abstract way. I am sufficiently existentialist to believe that ideas begin in the muck and mud of our experience. And what we experience, and then we look at it, we ask questions. Then we can abstract the idea, take it out of the experience, and we can examine it, but what I do in my fiction is I take those ideas that are perennial and I put them back into the muck and mud of human experience and drama. So you can feel palpably the question. It isn't just up here. It is a lived experience. So every one of my novels, and you could say some of those, the short stories too, to a large extent, have a question at their center that I am working through.
Do you start with that question? Do you start your novel with that question?
Well, if I'm working for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years on a novel, it has to be a burning question for me to keep coming back to it year after year and through 2,000 or 3,000 pages. It has to feel immediate to me. And I'm working my way through it with my head and my heart, and research, and finding ways finally to concretize it. Like I said, bring it back to the muck and mud of human quotidian living, everyday lived experience. We don't really have a philosophical tradition in America. We don't. In the 19th century, we had writers who certainly were philosophically interesting. Whether you're talking about Hawthorne, with his moral tales, or you're talking about Melville, right? Especially Moby Dick. It was different then. And then what happens in American literature is we had naturalism. It comes along. It's on the tail end of the naturalism in the sciences. You get the open boat. You get Stephen Crane. A certain way of interpreting experience and taking, like the scientific method. You don't, for example, apprehend or pull into the experience the spiritual register in people's lives.
Right.
You just kind of go at it in terms of the naturalistic attitude. Edmund Husserl called that the natural attitude, and Schweitzer had problems with it too. Once we get there with the naturalistic fiction, we're on our road then to Hemingway and minimalism and lots of other things, and also the idea that all you're doing as a writer is kind of like interpreting things that happen to you. Like an open boat. Crane, went out on an open boat. But the philosophical novel is rare in American literature. Now, among the French, they've had it, the philosophical story, all the way back to Voltaire, and Candide. It's just understood that philosophy and literature are sister disciplines. Here, we have an anti-intellectualism that really goes back to the 19th century. And I think it cripples our literature in many, many ways.
Why do you think we have that?
Because we're a democracy. And the idea around the time of Jefferson, I believe, is that the common man is most important. The common man, okay? We don't have kings and queens, and all. That's why we broke away from England, right? It's the common man. And so that's where you go. And for your stories, we don't. That's what it is. We have a long-term anti-intellectualism, a suspicion of intellectuals, and you could take that right up into the 60s with Spiro Agnew, the vice president for Nixon, having his problems with pointy-headed intellectuals, right? People who think too much. No. It's built into our literature largely. Yeah. So we don't have much in the way of a philosophical tradition. There have been writers who I feel are philosophically interesting, and they were about creating what I call the philosophical novel. One of them is Ralph Ellison with Invisible Man. Another one is Gene Toomer with his work that kicked off the Harlem Renaissance called Cain. I do think there's a philosophical dimension in Richard Wright, but particularly in terms of existentialism, and especially when he went to Paris and he's hanging out with Sartre and Simone, and they give him, a copy of Husserl's Phenomenology, which he puts a binder because he's working with it for reading it, everywhere he goes. There is an existentialist and Marxist certainly element in Richard Wright. Ellison is much more. I don't know. There's an efflorescence of ideas in Invisible Man, but we don't, generally speaking, have, in my opinion, a really intellectually engaging fiction here in America. The novel of ideas, no. But I'll tell you where you do sometimes find it: science fiction. Science fiction is very often about ideas, theories, scientific theory, and dramatizing those. That's why I love the genre since I was a kid. So, yeah.
Here, I wish if we had more time, I would talk to you about comic books and what you got from comic books, what you got from, because I think they are a form that has been often dismissed, although I think that's starting to change.
Oh, I think it's been changing ever since Mouse. But,
yes, I think so.
Yeah, because you got a major literary award, right?
Yeah.
The graphic novel is, hey, look, man, everybody is mining graphic novels for TV programs like The Walking Dead and movies. Every time you turn around, something is based on a graphic novel because essentially it's a storyboard. It's already been worked out in terms of shots and angles and close-ups and everything, right?
Yeah.
And I love comics because I'm an old cartoonist. And Abrams Comics Art is doing a graphic novel for Middle Passage. And the other thing that I just finished working on with Steve Barnes, a science fiction writer, is a series of 8 stories. We're calling it a graphic novel, but it's 8 stories, kind of like the Canterbury Tales, where every one of the characters tells a story that illustrates in a negative way the Eightfold Path of Buddhism. And they're all Steve's stories. He came up with the meat and potatoes, the story idea, the characters, the plot, and I just put in seasoning, in terms of philosophical stuff and, Buddhist stuff. But our guy, John Jennings, he really likes it. John Jennings is really directing Megascope, which you've probably heard of. That is a division of Abrams Comic Arts devoted exclusively to graphic novels by and about Black people. The first 2 adaptations that they did, John Jennings did the illustrations, Kindred and Parable of the Sower.
Oh, right.
Octavia Butler. The second one just came out quite recently, I think, Parable of the Sower. Long, 250 pages at least. And he's got other authors signed up too, for this particular graphic novel imprint. So yeah, I could talk about comics, but it's new to me, in a sense. I'm working on this. It's very new to me.
Well, it's new to you as a form to work in. It's not new to you as a fan.
No. I'm a fan from way back.
Yeah.
But it's new for me to work on it. You've got much more experience than I do with this as a form, Brian, I think.
That may be. But I just, I know you're a big Jack Kirby fan and Stan Lee, and I was just wondering how, because what I find is that those creators impact my work in very specific ways. And I think that because they did superhero comics and people punching each other and stuff and people flying and stretching and all of that, that people don't understand that there could be real depth there. And anyway, I just think it would be interesting to talk to you about that sometime.
We know the Marvel story about supposedly how they were going to go out of business, and Stan decided, okay, we're going to just do one last shot. I'm going to do what I always wanted to do, kind of Shakespearean stories and so forth. And you get the Fantastic Four, and then you get all the things after that.
That's him. That's a guy finding his voice. That was a guy not afraid to use his voice, right? Right. Yep. Well, I got nothing to lose. I might as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I love it.
There's some really good things in this. I wish we had more time to unpack things. Maybe we'll do another one. We'll do a follow-up or something. But I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Well, this has been a pleasure. Anytime I get to talk to you, Brian, is a joy and a pleasure. I learn, and we just kick back and have fun.
It's a good time. I can't wait till we can all be in the same room and have coffee or something.
Oh, yeah. That would be so nice.
It'll be nice when that happens. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ryan. Take care.
Thanks for watching You Are a Storyteller. If you have any questions or if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, leave a comment below or email us at hello@beliefagency.com.